My name is Amelia, and I carry a secret that has haunted me for 47 years. This is the story of a burden I never chose to bear, a child I both loved and feared, and the terrible choices that desperation forced upon me in the winter of 1855. This is the story of how love and hatred can exist in the same heart, how survival sometimes demands the unthinkable, and how the sins of masters become the curses of those they enslave. I was born in 1832 on the Thornfield Plantation in Mississippi, delivered into a world where my value was measured in dollars, and my future determined by the whims of men who owned my very breath. My mother, Violet, was a house servant, skilled in the delicate arts of maintaining a wealthy household, and from my earliest memories, I was being trained to follow in her footsteps. The Thornfield Plantation was one of the largest in Hinds County, spanning nearly 3,000 acres of the richest cotton land in Mississippi. Master Edmund Thornfield was considered a progressive plantation owner, a man who took pride in his reputation for treating his enslaved people with what he considered enlightened care. He provided adequate food, decent clothing, and medical attention when needed. He rarely used the whip himself and discouraged excessive brutality from his overseers. But progressiveness in the treatment of enslaved people was still slavery, still a system built on the fundamental denial of human dignity and freedom. And Master Thornfield's reputation for kindness masked darker truths that only those of us who lived in the big house truly understood. The Thornfield family consisted of Master Edmund, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children: Margaret, 17 when my story begins, Charles, 15, and little Elizabeth, barely 10. They presented themselves to society as the perfect example of Southern refinement and Christian virtue, attending church every Sunday, hosting elaborate social gatherings, and speaking eloquently about their responsibilities as stewards of the souls under their care. Mistress Catherine was a woman of delicate beauty and rigid social conventions, the kind of Southern belle who had been raised to manage a household while remaining decoratively ignorant of how that household actually functioned. She spent her days reading romantic novels, painting watercolors, and corresponding with relatives in Virginia and South Carolina. She treated the enslaved people with the distant kindness one might show to favorite pets, acknowledging our existence only when our services were required. I began working in the big house when I was 8 years old, starting with simple tasks like dusting furniture and polishing silver. My mother taught me the intricate protocols of serving wealthy white people, how to move silently through rooms, how to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how to make myself invisible while remaining constantly available. The work was easier than field labor, the living conditions better than the slave quarters, but house servants lived under a different kind of scrutiny. Every move was watched, every word analyzed for signs of disrespect or insufficient gratitude. We were closer to the family's daily life, which meant we were also closer to their arbitrary moods, their casual cruelties, their assumption that our thoughts and feelings were irrelevant to their comfort. As I grew older and my duties expanded, I began to notice things that troubled me in ways I couldn't fully understand. Master Thornfield's attention seemed to linger on the young women who served in the house, his eyes following us as we moved through our daily tasks. He found excuses to touch our hands when we served his meals, to stand close enough that we could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath, to comment on how we were developing into attractive young women. At first, I thought this was simply the normal behavior of a master who took interest in the welfare of his property. But as I reached my 15th birthday, the nature of his attention became impossible to ignore or misinterpret. It started with small gifts left in my room: a ribbon for my hair, a piece of candy, a book of poetry that he claimed might improve my mind. The gifts were accompanied by notes praising my intelligence, my beauty, my grace in performing my duties. He began requesting that I specifically serve his meals, attend to his study, help him with correspondence that required discretion. My mother watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing patterns she had hoped I would never have to experience. She tried to shield me when possible, volunteering for tasks that might require me to be alone with Master Thornfield, but her efforts were limited by the absolute authority he held over our lives. The first direct assault on my innocence came on a humid August evening when I was 16. I had been summoned to Master Thornfield's study to help him organize papers, a task that required me to work late into the evening when the rest of the family had retired to their rooms. The study was Master Thornfield's private domain, lined with books I longed to read, furnished with comfortable chairs and a mahogany desk that represented wealth beyond my ability to comprehend. Amelia, he said as I finished arranging the last of the documents. "You've become quite a beautiful young woman. Has anyone ever told you that you have extraordinary eyes? They're quite remarkable, like pools of honey in sunlight." I thanked him for the compliment, unsure of how else to respond, and began gathering the materials I had been using. But as I moved toward the door, he stepped into my path, blocking my exit with his body. "There's no need to hurry away," he said, his voice taking on a tone I had never heard before, soft and persuasive, but with an underlying current of authority that brooked no resistance. "I've been thinking that you deserve recognition for your excellent service, perhaps some additional compensation for your dedication." He reached into his desk and withdrew a small jewelry box, the kind that might hold earrings or a necklace. Inside was a gold locket, delicate and beautiful, the most valuable thing I had ever been allowed to touch. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained, lifting the locket from its bed of velvet. "I think it would look lovely on you. May I?" Before I could respond, he stepped behind me and fastened the chain around my neck, his fingers brushing against my skin in ways that made me uncomfortable, but which I didn't dare protest. His hands lingered longer than necessary, tracing the line of my collarbone, before settling on my shoulders. "Beautiful," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "You know, Amelia, I've grown quite fond of you. You're intelligent, graceful, and remarkably mature for your age. I think we could have a very special relationship, one that would benefit both of us." I tried to step away, but his hands tightened on my shoulders, holding me in place. "Master Thornfield," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. "I should return to my quarters. My mother will be wondering where I am." "Your mother understands that you serve at my pleasure," he replied, his voice hardening slightly. "And right now, it would please me for you to stay a while longer. I think you'll find that I can be very generous to those who show me proper appreciation." What happened next changed the course of my life forever. Master Thornfield's hands moved from my shoulders to my waist, pulling me back against him while he whispered words that made my skin crawl with their intimacy and possessiveness. When I tried to pull away, he reminded me that my mother's comfortable position in the house depended on my cooperation. That fieldwork in the brutal Mississippi sun might be too much for a woman of her age and delicate constitution. The threat was clear, and so was my powerlessness to resist it. Master Thornfield took what he wanted from me that night, and many nights thereafter, always with the same combination of false tenderness and underlying menace that made refusal impossible. For 2 years, I lived as Master Thornfield's secret concubine, summoned to his study or his private chambers whenever his wife was away visiting relatives or attending social functions. He convinced himself, and tried to convince me, that our relationship was somehow consensual, that the gifts he gave me and the slightly better treatment I received were evidence of genuine affection, rather than compensation for services I had no choice but to provide. The pregnancy began in the summer of 1850, when I was 18 years old. At first, I tried to deny the signs, hoping that the nausea and fatigue were symptoms of some illness that would pass without consequence. But as the weeks turned to months, and my condition became impossible to hide, I was forced to confront the terrible reality of what was growing inside me. The child was Master Thornfield's, conceived during one of his nocturnal visits to my quarters, and its existence threatened to destroy the carefully maintained facade of respectability that protected his family's reputation. Mistress Catherine might tolerate her husband's relationships with enslaved women as long as they remained invisible, but a mixed-race child bearing an unmistakable resemblance to her husband would be impossible to ignore or explain away. When I finally gathered the courage to tell Master Thornfield about my condition, his reaction was swift and terrifying. The gentle, persuasive manner he usually adopted with me disappeared, replaced by the cold calculation of a man whose political and social ambitions were threatened by an inconvenient pregnancy. "This cannot become public knowledge," he said, pacing his study like a caged animal. "My position in the community, my family's reputation, everything I've worked to build could be destroyed by careless talk and speculation." He proposed several solutions, each more horrifying than the last. I could be sold to a plantation in Louisiana before my condition became obvious, separated forever from my mother and everything familiar. The child could be given away immediately after birth, sold to traders who specialized in light-skinned slaves for wealthy households in other states. Or most terrifyingly, he suggested that there were remedies that could end the pregnancy before it became a problem. dangerous concoctions that might solve his dilemma while risking my life in the process. I begged him to reconsider, to find some solution that would allow me to keep my child and remain on the plantation where my family lived. I promised absolute secrecy, swore that I would never reveal the truth of the child's parentage, offered to accept any conditions he might impose in exchange for mercy. But Master Thornfield was beyond the reach of my pleas. His political aspirations included a possible run for state legislature, and any hint of scandal could destroy his chances before they began. The child I carried represented a threat to his carefully constructed image as a moral leader and Christian gentleman. It was Mistress Catherine who ultimately provided the solution, though not out of any kindness toward me. She had noticed my condition despite my efforts to conceal it, and she confronted her husband with the demand that he resolve the situation quickly and quietly. "I will not have bastard children running around this plantation," she told him in a conversation I overheard while serving their evening meal. "Either you deal with this problem, or I will, and my methods may not be as discreet as yours." The compromise they reached was typically cruel in its efficiency. I would be confined to a small cabin on the far edge of the plantation during the final months of my pregnancy, attended by a midwife whose discretion could be counted upon. After the birth, the child would be raised as the offspring of another enslaved woman whose own infant had died shortly after delivery, a common enough occurrence that few would question the substitution. I would return to my duties in the big house as if nothing had happened, and Master Thornfield would resume his nocturnal visits with the understanding that any future pregnancies would be dealt with more permanently. The child would grow up never knowing its true parentage, never understanding why it looked so different from its supposed family, never claiming the privileges that white blood might otherwise provide. The isolation during those final months was both blessing and curse. Away from the prying eyes of the big house, I could finally acknowledge the life growing inside me, without fear of immediate consequences. I could speak to my unborn child, sing lullabies, imagine a future where we might somehow find happiness together. But I was also forced to confront the terrible reality of what that future would actually hold. My child would be born into slavery, property of the man who had fathered it through violence and coercion. It would grow up never knowing its true heritage, never understanding why its features bore such a strong resemblance to the master of the plantation. And if anyone ever noticed that resemblance and spoke of it publicly, both the child and I would face consequences too terrible to contemplate. The birth itself was difficult, complicated by my emotional distress and the primitive medical care available to enslaved women. The midwife, an elderly woman named Hannah, who had delivered dozens of babies under similar circumstances, worked through the night to bring my child safely into the world. When I finally heard that first cry, when I held my son in my arms and saw Master Thornfield's unmistakable features reflected in his tiny face, I experienced a complex mixture of love and terror that would define the rest of my life. This beautiful, innocent child was both my greatest joy and my most dangerous secret. We had 3 precious days together before the substitution was arranged. I memorized every detail of his face, every sound he made, every small movement of his hands and feet. I named him David, though I knew he would be given another name by his adopted family. I sang to him, told him how much I loved him, promised that somehow, someday, I would find a way to claim him as my own. Then Hannah came to take him away, carrying him to a cabin in the slave quarters where a woman named Lucy was grieving the loss of her own infant. Lucy was a kind woman who understood the true nature of the arrangement, but was grateful for a child to raise and love. She promised to care for David as if he were her own son, to protect him as much as any enslaved person could protect another. Watching my child disappear into the darkness, knowing that I would see him grow up but never be able to acknowledge him as mine, was the most painful moment of my life. Part of me died that night, the part that had still believed in the possibility of justice or mercy in a world built on the systematic denial of both. I returned to the big house and resumed my duties as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Every day, I watched my son play in the slave quarters, saw him taking his first steps, heard his first words, witnessed his development into a bright, curious child who bore an increasingly unmistakable resemblance to his biological father. Master Thornfield resumed his nocturnal visits, but the dynamic between us had shifted. Where once there had been his pretense of affection and my forced compliance, now there was only mutual understanding of the power he held and the price I paid for my mother's security and my son's continued presence on the plantation. The years passed, and David grew into a beautiful child with light brown skin and green eyes that were identical to Master Thornfield's. His intelligence was obvious even at a young age, and he showed the same quick wit and curiosity that had characterized his father in more innocent times. But he also possessed a gentleness and empathy that his father had never shown, qualities that came perhaps from Lucy's loving care or from some deeper well of humanity that slavery could not completely corrupt. The resemblance between David and Master Thornfield became increasingly difficult to ignore as the child grew older. Other enslaved people on the plantation began to whisper about the similarity, though always carefully, and never in the presence of white people. Visitors to the plantation occasionally commented on the unusual appearance of one of the slave children, observations that made Master Thornfield's jaw tighten with barely concealed anxiety. The crisis I had been dreading finally arrived when David was 5 years old. Mistress Catherine's sister was visiting from Virginia, and she noticed David playing in the yard outside the big house. The resemblance to Master Thornfield was so obvious that she commented on it immediately, wondering aloud about the child's parentage in a voice that carried clearly to where I was working. "Edmund," she said to her brother-in-law, "that child looks remarkably like you did at that age. The eyes especially are quite striking. Who are his parents?" Master Thornfield's explanation about the child's origins was awkward and unconvincing, and I could see the suspicion growing in his sister-in-law's expression. She was a sharp woman who understood the realities of plantation life, and she clearly suspected the truth behind David's parentage. That evening, Master Thornfield summoned me to his study with an urgency that made my blood run cold. His usual mask of controlled authority had slipped, revealing the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. "The child has to go," he said without preamble. "I've arranged for a trader to take him tomorrow. He'll be sold to a family in New Orleans where his resemblance to me won't be noticed or commented upon." The words hit me like physical blows, each one driving the breath from my lungs and the strength from my legs. I fell to my knees in front of his desk, begging him to reconsider, offering any sacrifice he might demand in exchange for my son's continued presence on the plantation. "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand what's happening. Don't punish him for something that isn't his fault." "I'm not punishing him," Master Thornfield replied coldly. "I'm protecting my family's reputation and my own political future. The child's existence threatens everything I've worked to achieve. I won't allow a bastard to destroy my legitimate children's inheritance." "Then let me go with him," I pleaded. "Sell us both together. I'll never speak of what happened between us, never reveal his true parentage. Just don't separate us." Master Thornfield's laugh was harsh and without humor. "You're far too valuable to lose, Amelia. You know too many of this family's secrets, and your services are too useful for me to give up. The child goes alone, and you continue, as you always have." That night, lying in my small bed in the servants' quarters, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I could not save my son from slavery, but I could save him from the particular horror of being sold away from everything familiar, of growing up among strangers who might treat him cruelly, of never knowing that someone in the world loved him more than life itself. I had been saving small amounts of various herbs and compounds over the years, ingredients that my mother had taught me could be used for healing, but which I knew could also cause harm if administered incorrectly. Some were meant to ease pain, others to induce sleep, still others to calm anxiety or treat illness. Combined in the right proportions, they could provide a mercy that the slave markets of New Orleans would never offer. I prepared the mixture carefully, measuring each component with the precision my mother had taught me for healing remedies. The dose was calculated to work quickly and painlessly, to spare my son the terror and suffering that would otherwise be his fate. I mixed it into warm milk, sweetened with honey, a treat that David had always enjoyed. Before dawn, while Lucy still slept, I slipped into the cabin where my son lay, dreaming of games and adventures he would never experience. I held him in my arms one last time, sang the lullabies I had sung during those 3 precious days after his birth, told him how much I loved him, and how sorry I was for what the world had demanded of us both. He drank the milk without question, trusting me as children trust the adults who care for them. Within minutes, he was asleep again, this time permanently, his breathing growing shallow, and then stopping altogether as the mixture did its work. I held him until I was certain he was at peace, until his small body was still and cold in my arms. Then I began to scream. The sound that came from my throat was not entirely feigned, though I had to perform grief rather than simply experience it. I had to convince everyone who came running that I had discovered David's body, that I was a servant who had found a child dead in his bed from unknown causes. I could not allow anyone to suspect that his death had been anything other than the kind of sudden illness that sometimes claimed young children. Lucy woke to find me holding her adopted son's lifeless body, my screams bringing other people from the quarters, and eventually, from the big house itself. The grief that transformed her face when she realized what had happened was genuine and heartbreaking, and I added her pain to the enormous weight of guilt I would carry for the rest of my life. Master Thornfield arrived to find chaos in the slave quarters, people weeping and wailing over the death of a child who had been beloved by everyone who knew him. His relief at the resolution of his problem was visible, despite his efforts to appear appropriately saddened by the loss of valuable property. "These things happen," he told the doctor, who was summoned to determine the cause of death. "Children are fragile creatures, especially in this climate. It's unfortunate, but not unexpected." The doctor, a man who had seen many enslaved children die from various causes, agreed that sudden illness was a likely explanation. He wrote natural causes on the death certificate and advised that the body be buried quickly to prevent the spread of whatever had killed the child. David was buried in the slave cemetery behind the plantation, his grave marked only with a wooden cross that bore the name Lucy had given him rather than the name I had chosen. I stood among the mourners, playing the role of a grieving servant, while my heart broke with the knowledge that I had killed my own child to save him from a worse fate. In the months that followed, I continued my duties in the big house, as if nothing had changed. Master Thornfield resumed his nocturnal visits, though now there was a new element to our relationship, the shared knowledge of what I had done to protect his reputation. He never spoke of it directly, but I could see in his eyes the understanding that I was capable of actions he had never suspected. The secret I carried was enormous and poisonous, eating away at my soul with every passing day. I had saved my son from slavery by murdering him, had chosen his death over his suffering, had become the kind of person I had never imagined I could be. The knowledge that I was capable of such an act terrified me more than anything Master Thornfield had ever done to me. Lucy grieved deeply for the child she had loved as her own, never suspecting that his death had been anything other than cruel fate. I comforted her when I could, adding hypocrisy to my growing list of sins, helping her mourn the child I had killed. Years passed, and the secret continued to grow inside me like a cancer. I watched other children on the plantation grow up, saw them sold away or beaten or subjected to the countless cruelties that slavery inflicted on the innocent, and wondered if I should have chosen differently. Had I saved David from suffering, or had I simply taken away his chance to find happiness, despite his circumstances? The war came in 1861, bringing with it rumors of emancipation and the possibility of freedom for all enslaved people. Master Thornfield joined the Confederate Army, leaving his plantation in the hands of overseers who were less concerned with maintaining the facade of benevolent paternalism. Conditions became harsher, food scarcer, punishments more frequent and severe. When the Union Army finally reached our part of Mississippi in 1863, I was among the enslaved people who fled the plantation to follow the troops toward freedom. I carried with me only the clothes on my back and the terrible secret of what I had done to my son. I settled in Chicago after the war, working as a seamstress and eventually opening a small dress shop that catered to the city's growing population of former slaves. I never married, never had other children, never allowed myself the luxury of believing that I deserved happiness after what I had done. But I did find a kind of peace in helping other people who carried their own burdens from the time of slavery. I provided employment for women who had been separated from their families, offered shelter to children who had been orphaned by the war, contributed money to organizations that helped former slaves locate lost relatives. I lived
My name is Solomon, and I need to tell you about the night we rose up like thunder and lightning, when 200 souls said no more with one voice, and the Riverside plantation burned like a signal fire that could be seen across 3 counties. This is the story of how we planned our freedom, fought for our dignity, and left nothing but ashes where our chains used to bind us. I was born in 1820, on the Riverside Plantation in South Carolina, the largest cotton operation in Beaufort County, stretching across 4,000 acres of the richest soil the Lord ever made. Master Harrison Caldwell owned near 300 souls, men, women, and children, who worked his land from the first light of dawn until the stars came out to witness our exhaustion. The plantation was a world unto itself, with its own economy, its own laws, and its own terrible logic that reduced human beings to property to be bought, sold, and worked until they dropped. We lived in quarters that housed 8 families to a building, structures that wouldn't have been considered fit for livestock on a respectable farm. We ate cornmeal and fatback when the harvest was good, went hungry when it wasn't, and thanked the master for whatever scraps of mercy he chose to provide. The Riverside plantation had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations, each master adding to its size and productive capacity through the systematic exploitation of enslaved labor. By the time I reached manhood, it encompassed not just cotton fields, but also rice paddies, timber operations, a grist mill, a blacksmith shop, and all the infrastructure necessary to support a population of nearly 500 people, including the master's family, overseers, and various white employees. The big house sat on a small hill overlooking the entire operation, a magnificent Greek Revival mansion with white columns and expansive verandas that served as both home and symbol of the Caldwell family's wealth and power. From the master's study, Harrison Caldwell could survey thousands of acres of productive land and hundreds of people whose every waking hour was dedicated to increasing his prosperity. The slave quarters stretched along the bank of the Combahee River, 2 rows of wooden buildings that housed families in conditions that would have been considered scandalous if applied to any creature other than enslaved human beings. Each building was divided into 4 rooms, with each room housing an entire family regardless of size. Privacy was non-existent, sanitation was primitive, and the structures were built for economy rather than comfort or durability. I was different from many of the others in ways that would eventually make me dangerous to the system that enslaved us all. My mother, Ruth, had been a house servant before I was born, and she had learned to read from the master's children, a skill she passed on to me in secret during the long winter evenings when work in the fields was lighter. By the time I was 20, I could read newspapers, books, even the contracts and ledgers that tracked our lives like inventory in a warehouse. My father, Benjamin, was the plantation blacksmith, a skilled craftsman whose abilities made him valuable enough to receive slightly better treatment than the field hands. He taught me to work metal, to understand machinery, and to see how tools and weapons were made. These skills would prove crucial when the time came to prepare for our uprising, but in my youth, they simply marked me as someone with specialized knowledge that set me apart from my peers. Reading opened my eyes to a world beyond the plantation boundaries, a world where men like us lived as free citizens, owned property, made decisions about their own lives and the lives of their families. Through discarded newspapers and books that found their way to the quarters, I learned about the growing debate over slavery, about the Underground Railroad that helped people escape to freedom, about successful revolts in Haiti and other places where enslaved people had claimed their liberty through force of arms. I also learned about the economic realities that kept us enslaved. Master Caldwell's wealth was entirely dependent on our unpaid labor, and the entire social structure of South Carolina was built on the assumption that people like us would continue to work without compensation for the profit of our owners. The system wasn't maintained through individual cruelty alone, but through a complex web of laws, customs, and economic incentives that made our bondage profitable for everyone involved in the cotton trade. But knowledge without power is just another form of torment, and for years I channeled my rage into the kind of quiet resistance that didn't invite immediate retaliation. I helped other enslaved people learn to read in secret gatherings held in the deepest parts of the swamp, sharing newspapers and teaching basic literacy to men and women who hungered for connection to the wider world. I also began to study the plantation itself with the attention of a general planning a campaign. I mapped the locations of every building, every tool shed, every storage facility. I learned the routines of the overseers, the habits of the master and his family, the schedules that governed every aspect of plantation life. I identified the people among us who possessed the courage and intelligence necessary for coordinated resistance. The Riverside plantation was overseen by a hierarchy of white men whose authority was absolute and whose methods were brutal. The head overseer was a man named Marcus Webb, a tall, scarred veteran of Indian wars who carried himself like a soldier and treated the plantation like a military occupation. Webb had been hired specifically for his reputation for maintaining discipline through fear and violence, and he took pride in his ability to extract maximum productivity from enslaved workers through the strategic application of punishment and reward. Under Webb served two assistant overseers, James Morrison, a young man in his 20s, whose enthusiasm for violence seemed to increase with each passing year, and Frank Butler, an older man whose quiet sadism was perhaps more frightening than his colleagues' obvious brutality. Morrison carried out most of the physical punishments that Webb ordered, while Butler specialized in the psychological torment that could break a person's spirit without leaving visible marks. These three men controlled our daily lives with a combination of physical punishment, psychological intimidation, and the constant threat of separation from our families. They carried whips, pistols, and riding crops, and they used all of these tools liberally to maintain the discipline that kept the plantation profitable. They also maintained a network of informants among the enslaved population, offering small privileges to those who reported on their fellow workers. Webb, in particular, seemed to take personal pleasure in breaking the spirits of enslaved people who showed any sign of independence or defiance. He had been responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen people during my time on the plantation, always claiming that their demise had resulted from justified punishment for infractions against plantation rules. He once had a man beaten to death for allegedly stealing a chicken, though everyone knew the accusation was false and that Webb simply wanted to make an example. The social structure of the plantation was designed to prevent the kind of unity that would be necessary for organized resistance. House servants were encouraged to look down on field hands. Skilled workers were given privileges that separated them from common laborers, and everyone was constantly reminded that informing on fellow enslaved people could result in better treatment or additional privileges. Despite these divisions, there were networks of friendship and mutual support that the overseers couldn't completely destroy. Families maintained connections across different work assignments. Skilled workers shared knowledge and tools when possible, and people found ways to care for each other despite the system's attempt to turn us against one another. I gradually identified individuals who might be willing to participate in organized resistance. There was Marcus, a blacksmith who worked alongside my father and who had watched his daughter sold away to pay Master Caldwell's gambling debts. There was Rebecca, a house servant who had access to information about the family's movements and plans and who had been subjected to unwanted attention from Morrison. There was Joshua, a field hand whose strength and courage had earned the respect of workers throughout the plantation and who had been threatened with sale after a minor disagreement with Butler. Each of these people carried their own burden of rage and grief, their own reasons for wanting to strike back against the system that had stolen their lives and destroyed their families. But they also possessed qualities that would be essential for our success: intelligence, courage, and the ability to maintain secrecy under pressure. The breaking point that transformed my quiet resistance into active rebellion came in the summer of 1856, during a season when the combination of brutal heat, failed crops, and increased demands for productivity created conditions that pushed everyone beyond the limits of endurance. The summer had been particularly harsh, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees for weeks at a time and rainfall so scarce that the cotton plants began to wither in the fields. Master Caldwell, facing the prospect of a reduced harvest and decreased profits, responded by demanding longer workdays and higher productivity from people who were already laboring at the edge of their physical capabilities. My wife, Sarah, was 8 months pregnant with our first child when Webb decided that she was not contributing sufficiently to the day's cotton quota. Despite her obvious condition, despite the fact that she was barely able to walk without assistance, he demanded that she return to the fields and complete a full day's work alongside the other women. Sarah had been working as a house servant, helping with cooking and cleaning in the big house, lighter work that was appropriate for a woman in her condition. But Webb claimed that the plantation couldn't afford to have able-bodied workers performing easy tasks while the cotton crop was at risk, and he ordered her reassigned to field work immediately. When Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke after less than 2 hours in the blazing sun, Webb accused her of malingering and ordered her to be whipped as an example to the other workers. The sight of my pregnant wife being prepared for beating by a man who should have shown basic human decency to a woman carrying a child broke something inside me that could never be repaired. I intervened, stepping between Webb and Sarah, taking the lash across my own back rather than watching it fall on her swollen belly. The leather cut deep into my flesh, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the rage that consumed me, as I realized that this man was prepared to risk the life of my unborn child to make a point about discipline. Webb's response was swift and brutal. 25 lashes for me, administered immediately in front of the other field workers, followed by the threat that any future insubordination would result in Sarah being sold away from the plantation before the child was born. "You need to learn your place, boy," Webb said as Morrison prepared the whip. "You don't get to make decisions about how my workers are treated. You especially don't get to interfere when I'm disciplining lazy slaves who think pregnancy gives them special privileges." The beating that followed was administered with particular cruelty, each lash calculated to inflict maximum pain without causing permanent damage that might interfere with my ability to work. Morrison seemed to enjoy his task, taking his time between strokes to ensure that I felt every moment of agony. But as the whip fell across my back, as I tasted blood and dirt and felt my flesh being torn open, I made a decision that would change the course of many lives. I could no longer accept the daily humiliations, the constant threats, the systematic destruction of human dignity that defined our existence. If I was going to die, it would be as a free man fighting for his family, not as property being disciplined for showing love for his wife. That night, as I lay on my stomach in our cabin while Sarah tended the wounds on my back with water and strips torn from her only spare dress, I told her what I was planning. Her first reaction was terror at the thought of the consequences we would face if our rebellion failed, but as I explained my reasoning, she began to understand that continued submission might be more dangerous than resistance. "They'll kill us all if we try to fight back," she whispered, her hands gentle as she cleaned the blood from my wounds. "They're killing us already," I replied. "Just slowly, a piece at a time. At least if we fight, we die as human beings instead of as property." But individual resistance, no matter how heroic, was doomed to failure against the organized power of the plantation system. If we were going to strike back effectively, we needed coordination, planning, and the participation of enough people to make our rebellion something more than a dramatic gesture that would only result in more severe repression. I began reaching out carefully to other enslaved people who had shown signs of discontent with their circumstances. The conversations had to be conducted with extreme caution, since discovery would mean immediate death for everyone involved. But gradually, I identified a core group of people who were willing to risk everything for the chance of freedom. Marcus, the blacksmith who had lost his daughter, was the first person I approached. His rage at the system that had torn his family apart made him a natural ally, and his access to tools and metal made him invaluable for our preparations. When I explained what I was planning, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "I've been waiting for someone to talk sense about fighting back," he said. "Been thinking about it myself, but I knew it couldn't be just one man. We need numbers, organization, weapons. You got a plan for all that?" Rebecca, the house servant who had access to information about the master's family, was more cautious but equally committed once she understood the scope of what we were planning. Her position in the big house made her privy to conversations about business dealings, travel plans, and social events that could affect the timing of our uprising. "The master's been talking about hosting a big dinner party next month," she told us during one of our secret meetings. "Plantation owners from all over the county, maybe some politicians from Charleston. If we time this right, we could make sure the whole region knows what happened here." Joshua, the field hand whose strength and leadership had earned respect throughout the plantation, brought something equally valuable: the trust of the common workers who would form the backbone of our rebellion. When Joshua endorsed our plan, others listened, and gradually our circle of conspirators expanded to include dozens of people from every part of plantation operations. The planning took months of careful preparation, with meetings held in the deepest parts of the swamp during the dark of the moon, when our absence from the quarters was least likely to be noticed. We developed elaborate systems of communication using songs, gestures, and seemingly innocent conversations that allowed us to share information without arousing suspicion. We needed weapons, which we gradually accumulated by stealing tools from work sites, fashioning crude but effective spears from farm implements, and even managing to acquire a few firearms through Marcus's connections with free black people who lived near the plantation boundaries. The blacksmith shop became our armory, with Marcus creating weapons that could be disguised as ordinary tools until the moment they were needed. We studied the routines of the overseers and the master's family, identifying times when they would be most vulnerable to attack. We mapped escape routes through the swamp and forest, planning for the possibility that some of us might survive the initial uprising and need to flee toward freedom in the north. Most importantly, we worked to build unity among people who had been deliberately divided by the plantation system. This required patience, persuasion, and the gradual building of trust among people who had learned that survival often depended on keeping secrets, even from each other. House servants had to be convinced to give up their slightly privileged positions and join common cause with field hands. Skilled workers had to overcome their fear of losing the small advantages that set them apart from ordinary laborers. Everyone had to be persuaded that coordinated resistance was possible, that they could trust their fellow enslaved people with their lives, and that the chance of freedom was worth the certainty of death if our rebellion failed. The process was complicated by the presence of informants among the enslaved population, people who had been coerced or bribed into reporting suspicious activity to the overseers. We had to identify these individuals and either win them over to our cause or find ways to feed them false information that would protect our real plans. One of our most difficult challenges was maintaining secrecy while building the broad participation that would be necessary for success. We needed nearly 200 people to coordinate their actions simultaneously, but every additional person who knew about our plans increased the risk of betrayal or discovery. We solved this problem by creating a cell structure, where most participants knew only their immediate role and a few key contacts, while overall coordination remained in the hands of a small leadership group. This approach protected the broader conspiracy, even if individual cells were discovered, though it also made communication and timing more difficult. The psychological preparation was as important as the tactical planning. Most of the people we were asking to join our rebellion had spent their entire lives being taught that resistance was futile, that white people possessed superior weapons and organization that made victory impossible. We had to convince them that enslaved people were capable of military action, that coordination and determination could overcome advantages in equipment and training. We shared stories of successful rebellions in Haiti and other places where enslaved people had claimed their freedom through force of arms. We studied the tactics that had been used in those uprisings, adapting them to our particular circumstances and resources. We emphasized that our goal was not just destruction, but liberation, not just revenge, but the creation of something better. The date we chose was September 15, 1856, a Saturday night, when the overseers typically relaxed their vigilance and the master's family was planning to entertain guests who would provide witnesses to our uprising. We wanted the world to see what enslaved people could accomplish when they acted together with determination and courage. The signal for the uprising was to be the ringing of the plantation bell at midnight, a sound that normally summoned us to work, but which would on this night call us to war. Each group of conspirators had specific targets and responsibilities. Some would secure the weapons stored in the overseer's quarters, others would take control of the big house and prevent the family from escaping to summon help. Still others would begin the systematic destruction of every building and piece of equipment that represented our bondage. The week before our planned uprising, we received devastating news that nearly destroyed our entire enterprise. Thomas, a house servant who had been providing us with information about the master's movements, brought word that Webb had somehow learned of our plans and was preparing to arrest the leaders and scatter the rest of us to plantations throughout the Deep South. We never learned how our secret had been betrayed. Perhaps someone had been coerced into informing. Perhaps Webb had simply noticed unusual patterns in our behavior. Perhaps our meetings had been observed despite our precautions. But the threat was immediate and mortal. We could either abandon our plans and hope that our individual participation couldn't be proven, or we could move immediately before Webb could organize a response. The decision was made in a tense meeting held in the deepest part of the swamp, with men and women who knew they were choosing between almost certain death and the continuation of a life that was already a form of death. When the vote was taken, it was unanimous. We would strike that very night, regardless of whether all our preparations were complete. "We've been planning for months," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what we were deciding. "We got weapons, we got people, we got the element of surprise. If we wait, we lose everything. If we act now, we got a chance. A chance to die with dignity, added Rebecca, instead of living as property. The attack began at 10 o'clock, 2 hours earlier than originally planned, when Marcus led a group of 12 men in an assault on the overseer's quarters where Webb and his assistants lived. They moved silently through the darkness, their faces painted with mud to make them invisible, their weapons ready for the violence they knew was coming. The overseer's quarters were located in a separate building near the big house, close enough to the master's family to provide security, but far enough away to maintain the social distance that racial hierarchy demanded. The building housed Webb and his 2 assistants, along with their personal belongings, and a substantial cache of weapons that included rifles, pistols, ammunition, and the tools of punishment that had terrorized us for so long. Webb was apparently expecting trouble, because he met them at his door with a shotgun and 2 pistols, determined to sell his life dearly. The man who had seemed so powerful when he controlled our daily lives proved to be just another frightened human being when faced with organized resistance from people he had tormented for years. The fight that followed was brief but brutal, ending when Marcus struck him down with a hammer taken from the blacksmith shop where he had spent so many years creating tools for his own oppression. Webb's death was quick but not painless, and I felt no sympathy for a man who had shown no mercy to the people under his control. Morrison and Butler died fighting, taking several of our people with them, but failing to prevent us from seizing the weapons and ammunition that would be crucial for the night's work. Morrison's enthusiasm for violence served him poorly when faced with opponents who could fight back, and Butler's quiet sadism couldn't protect him from men who had endured his psychological torment for years. Their deaths removed the 3 men who had made our lives miserable for so many years, but more importantly, they eliminated the plantation's command structure and left the remaining white people without leadership or coordination. With the overseers dead and their weapons in our hands, the plantation's system of control collapsed immediately. While the assault on the overseer's quarters was taking place, another group led by Rebecca was moving against the big house, where Master Caldwell and his family were entertaining dinner guests from Charleston. The attack came without warning, overwhelming the few house servants who might have resisted and securing control of the building before anyone could escape to raise the alarm. The big house had always been the symbol of the master's power, the physical manifestation of wealth built on our stolen labor. Taking control of it was both practically important and symbolically crucial, demonstrating that the people who had been excluded from its comfort and luxury could claim it through force when justice was denied. Master Caldwell died quickly, struck down by men who had endured his orders and profited from his prosperity for their entire lives. His death was the end of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings, who had treated our suffering as a minor inconvenience in his pursuit of wealth and social status. His wife and children were given the chance to flee, along with their dinner guests, carrying word of our uprising to the surrounding countryside, but unable to prevent the destruction we were determined to complete. We had no quarrel with women and children, and our goal was liberation rather than massacre, but we also understood that witnesses would be necessary to spread word of what we had accomplished. With the plantation's leadership eliminated and its weapons in our hands, we began the systematic destruction of every building and piece of equipment that represented our bondage. This was the heart of our rebellion, the transformation of our rage into concrete action that would make it impossible for the plantation to continue operating as before. The cotton gin, the massive machine that had processed the fruits of our unpaid labor into wealth for the Caldwell family, was our first target. We smashed its delicate mechanisms with hammers and axes, reducing years of careful engineering to twisted metal and broken wood. The destruction felt like a physical release, each blow striking at the heart of the system that had enslaved us. The mill where we had ground corn for our meager rations was reduced to rubble, its grinding stones cracked, and its machinery scattered across the ground. The barns that had housed cotton worth thousands of dollars were set ablaze, their contents providing fuel for fires that could be seen for miles. The slave quarters where we had been housed like livestock were burned to their foundations, erasing the physical structures that had confined us while preserving nothing that could be used to house future enslaved people. We wanted to ensure that if the plantation was ever rebuilt, it would have to start from nothing. But the real symbol of our rebellion was the destruction of the big house itself. the magnificent mansion that had been built with wealth extracted from our labor and maintained by our unpaid service. This was the most dangerous part of our mission, since the flames would be visible throughout the county and would certainly bring armed response from neighboring plantations. We doused every room with kerosene, piled furniture and draperies into great pyres, and set fires that turned the night sky orange with the light of our defiance. The house burned magnificently, its expensive furnishings and elegant decorations consumed by flames that represented our answer to years of exploitation and abuse. As the house burned, some of our people danced around the flames, celebrating the destruction of the symbol of their oppression. Others stood silently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we had accomplished and the terrible certainty of what would come next. A few wept, not from sadness but from the release of emotions that had been suppressed for lifetimes of bondage. I stood with Sarah, holding her hand as we watched the flames consume the building where she had served as a house servant since childhood. Our unborn child would never know slavery if we could help it, would never bow to a master or submit to the lash. Even if we died that night, we had struck a blow for freedom that would be remembered long after our names were forgotten. The destruction continued through the night as we systematically eliminated every trace of the plantation's productive capacity. The blacksmith shop where Marcus and my father had labored was spared only long enough to retrieve additional weapons and tools, then reduced to ashes like everything else that represented our bondage. Livestock was released to wander free, carrying our rebellion into the surrounding countryside, in the form of economic disruption that would affect the entire region. Horses that might have been used to pursue us were either taken by our people or driven into the swamp where they would be difficult to recover. But we knew that our victory was temporary, that forces beyond our ability to resist were already moving against us. Master Caldwell's guests had escaped to summon help from neighboring plantations, and by dawn, mounted patrols would be converging on our location with overwhelming numbers and superior weapons. Some of our people chose to flee immediately, disappearing into the swamp and forest in small groups that might be able to evade capture long enough to reach free territory in the north. We had prepared for this possibility, establishing supply caches and safe routes that would give escapees the best possible chance of reaching freedom. Others decided to remain and fight, determined to make our rebellion as costly as possible for those who would restore the system of bondage. These were mostly men without families, people who felt they had nothing left to lose, but their sacrifice would buy time for others to escape and would demonstrate that enslaved people were capable of sustained resistance. I was among those who chose to stay, not because I believed we could win a sustained conflict, but because I wanted to give the others as much time as possible to escape. Sarah was in no condition to travel quickly through difficult terrain, and I would not abandon her to face whatever consequences our rebellion might bring. The first patrol arrived just after sunrise, a group of 20 men from the neighboring Morrison plantation who had ridden hard through the night to respond to news of our uprising. They found a landscape of destruction that exceeded their worst expectations. Every building reduced to smoking ruins, every piece of equipment destroyed, the very foundations of the plantation's existence erased by the determination of people they had thought incapable of such coordinated resistance. The sight of the destruction seemed to paralyze them momentarily, as if they couldn't quite believe that enslaved people were capable of such thorough and systematic action. The big house was a smoldering ruin, the cotton gin was twisted metal, and the slave quarters had been reduced to ash and charcoal. Decades of investment and development had been erased in a single night. The fight that followed was fierce, but brief. We had the advantage of knowing the terrain and fighting for our lives and freedom, but they had superior numbers, better weapons, and the tactical experience of men who had served in various military campaigns. We also lacked the military training that might have allowed us to maintain coordinated resistance against organized opposition. One by one, our defensive positions were overrun, our ammunition exhausted, our people killed or captured. We fought from the ruins of the buildings we had destroyed, using the rubble as fortification, but gradually we were forced back toward the river where escape became impossible. I was among the last to surrender, cornered in the ruins of the cotton gin with 3 other men who had chosen to make their final stand among the wreckage of our former bondage. When our ammunition ran out and further resistance became impossible, we threw down our weapons and prepared to face whatever justice our captors might choose to impose. The trials that followed were swift and predetermined, conducted with the efficiency of a legal system that existed primarily to protect the interests of property owners. Those of us who had survived the fighting were charged with murder, arson, and insurrection, crimes that carried mandatory death sentences under South Carolina law. We were defended by court-appointed lawyers who made no real effort to contest the charges, since the evidence of our guilt was overwhelming and the outcome had been decided before the proceedings began. The trials were conducted primarily for the sake of legal formality and to provide an opportunity for the authorities to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining order. But the trials also provided us with an opportunity to explain our actions to the world, to speak publicly about the conditions that had driven us to rebellion and the justice of our cause. When asked if I had any final words before sentencing, I stood and spoke for 10 minutes about the cruelties we had endured, the families that had been separated, the children who had been sold away from their parents, the women who had been violated, the men who had been worked to death. You call us criminals, I told the packed courtroom, but the real crime is the system that reduces human beings to property, that denies people the right to protect their families, that profits from the systematic destruction of human dignity. We burned your plantation because it was built on the theft of our labor and the denial of our humanity. If that makes us criminals, then we are proud to be criminals in service of a higher justice. 7 of us were sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out publicly as a warning to other enslaved people who might be contemplating similar resistance. The executions were scheduled for October 15th, exactly 1 month after our uprising, allowing time for word to spread throughout the region and for crowds to gather for the spectacle of our punishment. But even as we awaited death, we knew that our rebellion had accomplished something important. News of the uprising spread throughout the South, inspiring other enslaved people and terrifying plantation owners who suddenly realized how vulnerable they were to coordinated resistance. Security measures were increased throughout the region, with patrols, curfews, and new restrictions on the movement and assembly of enslaved people. More importantly, our uprising became part of the growing national conversation about slavery and its future in American society. Northern newspapers wrote extensively about the conditions that had driven us to rebellion, while Southern publications struggled to explain how such a coordinated uprising could have been planned and executed without detection. Sarah survived the violence and the aftermath, giving birth to our son 2 weeks before my scheduled execution. She named him Solomon after me, ensuring that some part of our struggle would continue into the next generation. Through the kindness of abolitionists who had taken up our cause, both she and the child were eventually transported to freedom in Canada, where they lived to see the end of slavery throughout the United States. On the morning of October 15, 1856, I walked to the gallows with 6 of my comrades, our heads held high and our voices raised in the spirituals that had sustained us through years of bondage. We died as free men, having chosen our fate rather than accepting the slow death of continued slavery. Our final words were not pleas for mercy, but declarations of our unshakable belief in the justice of our cause. The plantation we destroyed was never rebuilt. The land was eventually sold to pay the debts left by Master Caldwell's death, and much of it was allowed to return to forest and swamp. Local people claimed the area was haunted by the spirits of the enslaved people who had died there, but I prefer to think that what haunted the land was the memory of what we had accomplished on that September night when we rose up like thunder and lightning. Our uprising was one of many acts of resistance that helped bring about the end of slavery, proving that enslaved people were capable of organized resistance and that the system of bondage could not be maintained indefinitely against the determined opposition of those it oppressed. When the Civil War finally came 5 years later, many of the tactics we had developed were used by other groups of freedom fighters who remembered our example and built upon our experience. The fire we set on the Riverside plantation burned for 3 days, sending smoke signals